So as of right now, Starlink hasn't come out with a dedicated offering for recreational boaters. But if you look at their coverage map, it's pretty clear that there's coverage about 10 miles off the coastline. So it really leaves it up to us to figure out of 4 different offerings, which one makes the most sense to put on a boat. And while that's exciting, it's also a bit overwhelming. All you have to do is walk down a dock, and even though we're all boaters, it's pretty simple to see that we use our boats in very different ways, which compounds the complexity of making this decision, and it can be paralyzing. So the goal of this video is we're going to demystify the 4 different offerings of Starlinks. To do that, we'll talk about 8 different areas, including costs, performance, power consumption, the size of these dishes, water resistance rating, wind resistance rating, installation considerations, and in-motion support. On top of it, we're going to drop them into 4 different scenarios of different types of boaters and how they might use Starlink on their boat. Hopefully by the end of it, it's going to be crystal clear as to which one makes the most sense for you. So before we jump into the differences of these 4 Starlink offerings, let's talk about the similarity. They all come with a Wi-Fi router, so you can connect your devices to it. The other one is that they run on 120 volts. Now, the first offering that we'll speak to is the Residential Dish. This thing costs $599 for the equipment, $110 per month to be able to use it at your home. But if you're going to use it on your boat, you have to add what they call the portability feature for $25 a month. This is pretty cool if you already have a Starlink to be able to dip your toe in the water, so to speak, to try this out. But it probably isn't an option for most of us because most areas are already oversubscribed for residential Starlink until they get more satellites up in the sky to be able to take on more capacity. Now with this option, generally when you're at home, you can get up to 150 megabits per second of download speed. That's pretty darn good. However, when you put it on your boat, it shifts into what they call best effort mode. And this best effort mode means that you'll still get that great performance if you're in a low congested area, but if you're in a high congested area, if you're moored next to a cruise ship, or if you are in a high density area like a city, then you may be throttled down to 1 to 10 megabits per second. It's what we've seen, which it can be fairly disappointing and discouraging when you're in those areas. Now switching to power consumption, it's about 45 to 75 watts that these draw. That's about what your standard radar would draw. So that's not too hard on your batteries through an inverter, certainly not an issue if you're on shore power. Now, since this is a residential dish, it is 11 inches by 20 inches, and it has what can be problematic on a boat, and that is this pole that comes out the back, and it has motors that makes it really easy to install it on your house, because all you have to do is give it a fairly good direct line of sight to the north, and then the dish will adjust itself nicely to really get the best performance of the exposure to the satellites in your area. However, this can be problematic if you think about a boat and you go anchor out. Within an hour, especially with tide exchanges or winds, you may point every direction on the compass within an hour. And that means that the dish is going to have to drop its signal and readjust over that time, and that means you have dropouts, and that can be frustrating. So this is where it's important to explain the difference between the technology that Starlink uses and what the traditional type of satellite dishes used. And what I mean by that is the traditional satellites would have to point very precisely to a stationary satellite that was in orbit to be able to receive and transmit a signal. Now, Starlink, because you've got satellites zipping around all over the place in low orbit, uses what they call a phased array. And so this flat phased array electronically tracks the satellites up in orbit. Now you might say, well, why the heck did they point it to the north if it's doing that? Well, they used to have a very thin constellation of satellites, and they are predominantly from the equator northward as well in their positioning. So now that there's so many satellites up there, we have got to the point where laying a Starlink dish flat actually has better performance, lower dropouts, and has really created an evolution of the hardware that makes it perfect for boats. Starlink has taken advantage of this with a recent firmware update for the dish that when it senses slight movement, instead of trying to reposition, it actually takes itself and goes completely horizontal or flat. So let's move on to the water resistance rating. This dish is an IP54, which means it can take a direct splash of water to it. And the wind rating is up to 50 miles an hour. The installation can be as simple and what I consider precarious is taking the standard tripod that ships with your dish and just putting it on your bow. And there are different implementations that we've seen as well, where people will take the pole of the dish and put it in a fishing rod holder, all the way up to adapters that are custom made to be able to have your dish snap into and then screw onto a standard marine 1-inch antenna holder. Then we get into the portability side of the house when we think about in motion. Portability means that you can move it one place to the other, but it doesn't mean that you can use it in motion. In fact, the terms of service say that it is not supported for in motion. Now, in practicality, we found that it's actually functional up to about 8.5 knots before Starlink will drop the service on you. And when I say that, they don't permanently drop the service, but you need to stop moving before it's going to pick back up. Now, for a trawler or a sailboat or on the hook, that works out just fine, but it is something to keep in mind. The next offering is the RV Dish. So this one costs $600 for the equipment, and it's $135 a month. Cool part is you don't have to wait for availability on it, and the other one is you can pause the service when you're not using your boat. So that $135, you're not going to get nailed for that every month. It's only during the months that you're using it. The downside is this is always best effort speeds. So if you're in a non-congested area, we've seen great performance out of this dish, up to 150 megabits per second. However, if you're in a highly congested area or you have a cruise ship that's nearby, you can be capped from that 1 to 10 megabits per second. From a power consumption standpoint, it is exactly the same, 45 to 75 watts power consumption like the residential one, because it is basically the same equipment. The same thing goes for the size of the equipment. It's exactly the same as that residential one. However, since this is a dedicated dish, you do see a lot of people that are starting to modify them to be able to go on their boat and make them a flat dish. Water resistance, obviously why people end up doing this type of modification is it improves the water resistance and it also improves the wind rating as well, because it's not on a pole getting blown around. The last thing is, again, the installation is identical of what you might do with the residential one, unless of course you've modified it to be a flat dish. In that case, you're just going to mount it to the top of your boat. Mobility, again, cuts off support after 8.5 knots. Which brings us to the RV Dish that has in-motion support. Now that seems pretty exciting because that's a lot different than the other two offerings that we talked about so far, but there's also another difference that's not quite as exciting, and that's the price. It's $2,500 for the equipment. Now, the good part is it's still only $135 a month for the service. You don't have to wait for availability. Again, you can pause the service when you're not using it, and it is subject to the best effort speeds. However, when we talk about performance, the one thing that's different is this particular dish can see speeds up to 300 megabits per second. In fact, I've seen much higher speeds in practice when we're out in non-congested areas. But again, it can be as low as 1 to 10 megabits per second if we're in highly congested areas. Now, the power consumption is a big difference here too, and it's not definitely in a good way. it draws from 110 watts to 150 watts, and that's some serious draw. In fact, even so much so that the cable that they use for this dish is physically larger to be able to deal with that additional power consumption. Now, for a boat like ours, we have a 10 kilowatt inverter with 21 kilowatt hours of lithium iron phosphate batteries. So again, for us, it's not that big of a deal, but for an average boat that has lead acid batteries or limited wattage on their inverter, this could be an exclusionary type of requirement when you think about this larger dish. And when I say larger, I'm not messing around. This thing is 22 inches by 20 inches. It's basically twice the size of the standard RV or residential dish. That extra size gives you an upside, especially when we think about performance. It has a 140-degree view of the sky, so that's an additional 40 degrees of being able to capture the skyline, and that means it has less dropouts and it deals with obstructions much better. So that basically equates to just greater dependability when you're at anchor or in tight anchorages. Now, the water resistance is another rating that actually improves above the standard RV or residential one, and it has an IP56 rating, which basically means it can handle a direct water spray. Now, if you think that's a nice improvement when we think about the durability, the wind rating is really a significant improvement. It goes from the 50-mile-an-hour rating of the residential or RV standard to 174 miles an hour. So if you're in areas that have high winds or subject to hurricanes, this is a game changer. Now, the reason that it can deal with these types of differences and has this higher rating is because it is a flat dish and it mounts that way on the top of your boat. There's a wedge mount that has about an 8-degree slant to it so that it helps shed not only rain and hail, but snow as well. And we've actually seen this in practice, and it does a pretty darn good job when the heaters are engaged on the dish. So the implementation on the installation is a lot more elegant when we're thinking about putting it on a boat. And it has a nice watertight gland for the cable that it goes in. The only thing that I would say that is a little awkward is that they have the cable entering the front of the dish, which it just doesn't look tidy. So if I had to give any feedback to the engineers, I think I'd have them put that cable that plugs into the dish somewhere underneath the dish or the back or something, but I just don't like the way that it looks. Now, when we talk about in-motion support, this is a big change as well when we think about the previous two offerings, in that it literally does support in motion. So there's no longer that cutoff at 8.5 knots. So if you're making long passages to different destinations and you need to be on meetings or being able to leverage connection to the internet, it's pretty nice being able to have that and not worrying about being dropped out. Which brings us to our last offering, and this is the Maritime Dish. Dishes, I should say. It actually has two of these large flat dishes. Now, when we talk about the cost, this is staggering, and this is the reason why I separate it from the recreational boaters and into this commercial offering. It is $10,000 for the equipment, and it is $5,000 per month. Now, the good side is if you have this particular plan, you can pause the service. So when you're doing refits or the vessel is not in service, you can actually shut that down. But that's a pretty eye-watering difference when we think about the actual cost. The performance, when we think about that, there is no longer this best effort throttling. So these dishes can truly get that 300 plus megabit per second download performance that you would expect, and that's the whole idea of the support of this and why it costs so much more. The power consumption is staggering. You now have two of these dishes, so you're talking about 220 to 300 watts. That's a serious draw, but any vessel that these two dishes are going to be sitting on, they have more than enough power through having generators running or extremely deep battery reserves and inversion, so it's not going to be that big of a deal for them. And when we think about the size, like I said, these are 22 by 20 inch dishes, and there's two of them. And there has to be a consideration about how close you can put these together, because they will interfere with one another. We've seen in practice under 4 feet that they will actually block each other. However, the installation manual from Starlink says that they need to be 14 feet away from each other. Now, generally speaking, any boat that these things are going to be going on, having a 14-foot differential is probably not that big of a problem, but it is something that you're going to have to be thinking again about. The water resistance, again, is IP65, and the wind resistance is 174 miles per hour. The final difference with the Maritime offering is that not only does it support in-motion, but ultimately it will support globally all open water oceans. They still need to put a lot more satellites up in the sky and be able to get clearance from different countries for their near-shore access. But ultimately, that is the goal with the Maritime solution that none of the other solutions will be offering. Before we talk about which dish makes the most sense for the different type of cruisers, we do want to point out that you really want to take into consideration different obstacles that you'll have on your very unique boat. And when I say that, think about halyards, think about your masts, your radars, those types of things. If you have a mast, sailboater, you definitely want to move that dish as far away from that mast to minimize the obstruction that it creates for the dish. Everybody tends to have radars. If you think about radars, they can have as much as a 6-degree beam coming from that radar, and if your Starlink is in the path of that beam, it'll block it. We've seen more than a handful of times where people have struggled with that. So think about not only a preferred area to put your dish, but have a couple backup areas as well, because when you do buy your dish, you're going to want to do a temporary install to make sure that you don't have any obstructions or issues with things like radar. First one is nearshore recreational boaters. These folks tend to go out for the weekend, maybe a couple weeks for the year. They're going to want to be able to stream videos, surf the web, and be able to read emails. It's not going to be a big deal to them if they have a few 2-second to 15-second dropouts during the day. They're just stoked to be able to have internet on their boat. Now the next one is extended cruisers or liveaboards. Now, they not only want to have the same access to the internet that our other recreational folks do, but they're also going to be doing some work-related items as well as some limited Zoom calls. Having those dropouts for 2 seconds to 15 seconds a few times during the day, again, isn't going to be a big deal for them. And that brings us to the third type of boater. These are hardcore liveaboard cruisers, and these folks tend to work remotely. They need to have access to the internet, not only for personal reasons, but they're doing a lot of work. They're super dependent on video conferencing, and they can't have those dropouts at all during the day because it creates a non-professional experience for their team members that they're working with and their clients as well. All that being said, here are our recommendations by the 4 different boater types. Number 1, the nearshore recreational weekend boater. Again, wants to stream video, have a connection to the internet, and be able to check email. Not worried about some 2 to 15 second dropouts a few times during the day. If I had a residential dish already, the easiest thing to do is add portability, buy an additional cable and a router, and just heck, put it on the bow with your tripod and call it quits. Yeah, you're in good shape. Obviously not all of us have that option, so that puts us into recommending the standard RV option. Personally, I would buy that and I would get a permanent mount for it. The fishing pole one or putting it on the tripod, it works, but in the long run, putting a nice proper adapter on that the Starlink can snap into, screws into a standard marine 1-inch antenna mount, and running your wires in your boat like you would any of your electronics makes the most sense in our perspective. Which brings us to the extended cruising or liveaboard boater group. They want to be able to stream video, have access to the internet, as well as be able to do some Zoom meetings, but we're, again, not worried about a few dropouts of 2 to 15 seconds per day. Our recommendation would, again, be to get the standard RV edition. I probably would complement that with a router that has a cellular data plan and can combine the network connection to the internet with the Starlink and the cellular plan. That creates a higher level of redundancy between the two of those. The other option that I might go with is to modify that dish so that it is a flat mount, improving not only the consistency of connection, the waterproof rating, as well as the wind rating. It does void your warranty, but at the end of the day, it's probably going to be a more robust and elegant solution for you when you think about mounting it on the boat. I will say, moving into the next category, which is our hardcore liveaboard cruisers, and those who are working remotely and just can't have the dropouts that others can have in the previous two categories because they're so highly dependent upon video conferencing. In this instance, I have 2, maybe 3 options that I'm going to recommend. So the first one is to get the high performance in motion dish. You increase the performance, you reduce your dropouts. It's still $135 per month, but it really increases the durability of the dish. I think the trade-off is worthwhile when you think about the price. Another option is to get 2 of the regular RV offerings, have the backs cut off of those, and mount those independently. You'd probably be into those with the modifications for about $1,000 per dish. You're at $2,000 now. You're still $500 in the black, but what I would do then is I would buy a router like a Peplink that would be able to combine those 2 internet connections again and have redundancy between the 2 dishes, which would really help out with consistency of connection. Again, you give up your warranty, there's that trade-off, so it might make more sense to just get the single high performance wedge mount flat dish. I'm sure the question is going to be, well, what the heck have you done? Well, on the Elli-Yacht, we have gone with that hardcore liveaboard implementation that has a in-motion high-performance RV dish, as well as a modified flat mount standard RV dish. And that is fully integrated with 3 cellular connections to be able to provide data redundancy as well. So that means if we are in a highly congested area that our Starlinks are not able to perform because of the data throttling and best effort, that means we have great coverage and redundancy with our cellular data plans. The farthest reaches of British Columbia and Desolation Sound, which has no cell coverage whatsoever, and with our redundant Starlink offerings going through a solution that binds together both of those internet connections, we have great redundancy that way as well. Is it going overboard? No pun intended. Yeah, for most, absolutely. But there is no way that we would be able to continue to work the way that we do and be able to cruise to the places that we want to without this type of solution, which literally means a year and a half ago, this wasn't even a possibility. Which brings us to the last and final type of user, and that is the commercial user. And so if you think about cargo ships, you think about cruise lines, the Maritime solution makes a ton of sense. So hopefully this is valuable to you. Don't forget to like or subscribe. We're going to be coming out with additional videos of how we install the different dishes. We'll be talking about our implementation of how we bring together all these internet connections through our PepLink solution as well, and the different types of antennas that we use in some upcoming videos. Have a great week. Thanks a lot. Safe sailing.